them in the chat and I'll be watching it and asking him as we go along.
Okay, and yeah, I've got to blow through this presentation because I've given it before, and every time I try to cut it, it's uncuttable because there's just so much that I want to say. Hopefully, I've made it efficient. My name is Mike Hayes, and before I share my screen, I wanted to look at everybody. I am first and foremost a school counselor over at Chisholm Trail Middle School in, I guess it's in Rome. It's right on the Rome-Newark border. And a lot of you may not be familiar with either place, so it doesn't matter where I situate myself there. I am a therapist. I own a small practice of my own, and then I work at a place called Wise County Christian Counseling. And I'm not transitioning out of school counseling. It is always going to be my first love. Right now, my reason for being a private therapist is because we're still trying to figure out how to do some of these things in the school. I've been on some conversations with Dr. Benavides and others that I love being a part of. I'm kind of the learner in the room, because a lot of those guys have figured out ways to do it in other districts and figured out how to work it within what's allowable. What I want to give you today, and I'm going to share my screen now. Nope, that's not how to do that. There we go. Sharing the screen. All right. So my PowerPoint is, if you'll email me, I've put my email down at the bottom. Any questions or anything that you want, including this PowerPoint. And I think it's important that I give you this PowerPoint. So, because I'm timing myself because I want to make it all the way through. And if there's something that you see flash on the screen and I skip over, that happens to me all the time. Somebody says, hey, that was something I wanted to know about, and you breezed through it or you skipped over it. So please, let's have a dialogue about that. There's my email at the bottom, mikehayescounseling@gmail.com. That's not me promoting myself so much as it is just something that's easy to remember. It's Hayes without an E, and remember that counseling is one L unless you live overseas where they spell it with two. So what I want to talk about is changing lives of children who have experienced trauma. And what I want to emphasize is that a lot of times we, in our own reactions to stressful situations, we tend to look at what's wrong with the child, or look at it, frame it in terms of what is wrong with this child, instead of looking at what the child's life experiences are and teaching them to properly handle things. And a lot of that comes from our own stuff. We look at why kids struggle and we think about what can we do about it, but we fail to realize that a lot of it has to do with our own struggles and our own attempts to figure out what's going on in our own lives. One of the things, I'm going to mention a book in a minute that I've mentioned several times. I feel like a lot of you have heard me say this, maybe to broken record status, but Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, his book, The Body Keeps the Score. I see some of you nodding your heads, so I know that you've heard of it, and a lot of you have. One of the things he points out in that book is the best research is me search. And when I know as a therapist, a lot of my own time reflecting on myself and my behavior, my reactions, my cognitions, really informs some of the interventions and some of the ways that I'm able to work with kids. And that's definitely true in the school counseling setting as well. Uh-oh, I've got some timings enabled. That may work in our favor. So here's a couple of books. The Body Keeps the Score I mentioned. That book is very easy to read, and you know, it goes through everything. It's a really good book because it mentions some of the other therapies. It's not a book focused on one therapy or one modality. It covers a bunch, and some of the underpinnings of the brain and what we do and how we do it based on our understanding of the brain. The other book that I put out here on the right side of your screen is a great resource as far as SEL, and I'll mention a little bit more about DBT down the road in the presentation. But this is a practical workbook, as it says. There's a section for students to work through. There's a section where the teacher or the counselor, whoever's facilitating a group or a class, can work through these things. And then there's a section for the student. I need to get this out of the way right at the front, just because it would be unethical for me to point out that there are a lot of, we always have to consider ethics, and you always have to operate within your training. Now, training doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out and get your LPC, but there are ways to get trained in some of these techniques. Some of you are familiar with the website PESI, P-E-S-I, and they have some great trainings. There are a few modalities that I wanted to practice, DBT being one of them. They have training online where you can go and you can get the different levels of certification within DBT. PESI is great if you need staff development hours or LPC hours. Particularly LPC hours, I guess. That's a great place to go. So our tasks in talking about healing trauma, it's important to realize that tasks are in community. We share this with a group of other teachers, other counselors. We get parents involved, other stakeholders. And when we share in community and when we're focused on a classroom as community, and when we think about normalizing, that's one of our key areas of business, is normalizing and removing the stigma that kids feel. I learned a long time ago when I started at Wise County Christian Counseling, one of the guys told me that you know, he was working with some very you know, with some clients with some very significant pathology. I'll put it that way. And he said that the way he does that, what he's learned over time, is that the main arrow in your quiver is normalizing what someone's going through. Because if they feel like they are outcast, if they feel like they are strange, if they feel like they are sick, or that they're coming to you because something is wrong with them, then they're going to be very reticent to get your help and to listen. But if you just listen to them, whether they're lying to you or fabricating, or their perception of reality is very different than the norm, giving them a place where they can listen is the key skill in what we do. And I know that you guys can agree with me in that. But the other tasks in trauma specifically, I've got them listed here, are reestablishing community, because trauma has a way of isolating. I know as we go through this period of isolation, it's interesting to note that the very act of being isolated resembles trauma in a lot of ways. And so establishing community, welcoming kids back, and that's the business of normalizing. Teaching kids to take effective action. Trauma, as a victim of trauma, you feel like your sense of autonomy, your sense of control is gone. And giving kids the ability to see, okay, what are your goals and where are you headed in your life? How can I help you get there? And letting them know that they are the agents, you know, reestablishing agency for them. Traumatized kids, traumatized individuals have trouble dealing with their affect regulation. they have trouble. They're more prone to mirroring the affect of someone else. So if you're upset, they get upset. Instead of saying, well, that person's upset, let me evaluate why they're upset and determine whether I also want to get upset too. They're very, they fluctuate based on what's going on. You know, they are thermometers, and they're very reactive. Another key item of business is accessing the emotional brain and knowing oneself. Kids learning, this goes kind of along with affect regulation, but kids learning how to handle their brain and what's going on in their brain, and realizing that your brain is another part of your body. You know, I don't want to get too philosophical here because it can get weird, maybe. It's not weird, but it would take a while to explain my way out of it. But getting kids to realize that the emotions and the brain itself and our reactions are a part of the body. And as such, we have the ability to step back and realize what's going on and to control that and to regulate that. And then the last thing is being able to tell the truth, bringing things out into the light and giving kids a way to talk about what's going on. So here are the counseling modalities that I'm going to touch on today as far as treatments for trauma. I color-coded these, and then it ended up that they came in twos. These first two are what I would imagine just about everybody is involved with already in some level. Some form of person-centered therapy, where you're focused on the individual and the core tenets of counseling. And then cognitive behavioral therapy in an educational setting. I don't know how you could steer away from this too much. Analyzing the behavior and figuring out ways to reframe that and reset things like that. Those are the ones that I put in blue because those are very safe. They're just kind of natural to what we are as counselors. The next two are things that are already being used in schools, but I think they're used more by our behavior interventionists than they are by us as counselors. And I think we should do a really thorough job of acquainting ourselves with motivational interviewing and then ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. I think these two really fit well. In fact, ACT is based on what's called relational frame theory, which is just a way of getting kids, there we go, that's gonna do that on me some, to analyze their behavior. Now the yellow I put down here because these are ones that I would caution you are usable, but as far as using them specifically as what they are, you would need to be a little bit cautious. But these are the ones that I'm gonna say, hey, pick and choose the things, the skills and the techniques within them that work well for you, that work well in what you do. You're just not able to say, hey, I'm a practitioner of this, or just really go down that rabbit hole, that beautiful rabbit hole, without getting proper training. And so that's why I put those in yellow. And then the red are the ones that unfortunately are really the most powerful in dealing with trauma. EMDR I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then I might get a little bit into the body focus modalities. These are things that really do require, because they're so technique based rather than equipping and skills and homework based. But they are wonderful things to know about and wonderful things to get trained in if they're things that you think would be helpful to you, if you're comfortable proceeding and looking into that as a counselor. All right, so one of the things I want to say, and this is something I do with every single person I counsel in a therapy setting, and I've started doing this a lot with kids. And this is not anything that's necessarily original to me. I thought of it, and then right after I thought of it, I noticed that Brene Brown mentioned something very similar, and that is all well and good. But getting kids to realize, I am a person who blank. What is my identity? And I think one of the key ways to recognize a kid who has really possibly been through some trauma is that they don't have a sense at all of who they are. There's a part of the brain called the insula that's significantly traumatized during the events that are preceding that trauma, that are part of the trauma. But getting kids to focus on this and clarifying this for kids is really how you move through a kid with trauma, how you move through that event with them, how you see, okay, this is where you are in the process of processing and dealing with that trauma. I apologize if I've got alerts coming on here. My daughter set something up weird. She used my computer for something. So I've got teenage girls. Don't ever let them use your computer for anything. All right. I'm going to skip over this, but I would encourage you to go back and read it. I've actually touched on a lot of those things. I can't go through a trauma presentation without talking about the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. These are the 10 ACEs that are identified, and a lot of you are familiar with these, and maybe even to the point where you're tired of hearing about them. But the 10 ACEs that are measured in the ACEs study, there's a very simple survey that you can give kids. I would precede that with getting proper permission from parents and your administration, but seeing where a kid's at with these 10 is a strong indicator of some of the problems that they might be able to get into later. In addition to those, a lot of the things that we overlook as far as trauma, and I believe could be very easily included in the ACEs study. Some of these are kind of folded in, but I think these are things that need to be brought out because they're not specifically mentioned. Household dysfunction or dysregulation. So not just dysfunction, not just a family that is in turmoil, but just one that doesn't equip a kid properly. Long separations from caregiver. This could include military deployment, or parents that are away significant amounts of time on business. Ongoing misattunement. This is just communication issues. Maybe a traumatized parent is really doing the best they can, but because of their own things, they have trouble relating properly to their child. So the child is not necessarily traumatized, but there are issues with their attunement with their caregiver that could resemble trauma. Being made to feel like a burden, rejected, unloved, or blamed. And then microaggressions. I've heard it said that microaggressions such as being exposed to racism or sexual discrimination, that might be added as an ACE down the road. Right now, I need to break it out as a separate thing. So we know that toxic stress physically changes a child's brain, but kids don't always react in the same ways. It's based on how predictable that stress is. It's based on the level of that stress. And I put it in red, the amount of support available. I'm gonna harp on support a lot through this because developing those relationships, having the ability to attune with people, and being able to have your feelings listened to and learn to listen to other feelings, those things help improve people's lives. So here's a wonderful graphic that puts a lot of the ACEs in a nutshell. I'll make this available. This is not mine. This is something I got from a campaign over in the UK. But it shows that childhood trauma, 2 times more likely to develop depression, 3 times more likely to develop anxiety. And one of the things you'll see on the right-hand side over here, a traumatized brain is born, or a traumatized brain, not born, a traumatized brain develops to the point where it's bottom heavy. And that bottom part of the brain, when I'm simplifying this and explaining it to younger kids, the bottom part of the brain is the seat of our emotions and our response to stress, our response to danger. And that's where we kind of live when we're going through those situations. The key is to get up to the point where you're in your executive functioning and your language center, where you can actually put labels on things and identify and categorize things so that you can more effectively deal with these. You'll see, just to talk about biology real quick, the prefrontal cortex, which is where you do your thinking, underactivated during stress and trauma. The anterior cingulate cortex, that's where your emotional regulation abilities are. That's compromised, that's underused and underactivated. And then the amygdala, of course, I'll spare you some biology today. If you need more of that, come see me because I got plenty on it. But the amygdala is overactivated. So your little fire alarm during trauma is going off long after that danger or long after that trauma has passed. Here's a quick graphic. Some of you in my district will recognize this. Our lead counselor for the district shared this with us. And this shows in a classroom how many ACEs a kid goes through on average. So in a classroom of 30 kids, and the magic number is 4, 4 ACEs is where you can start seeing some prolonged difficulty, significant difficulty occurring. You'll see that at least a third of your average class has kids with significant levels of toxic stress. I'm going to skip through some of these statistics. You can go through these on your own. This is just kind of setting the stage for what happens when kids go through trauma or individuals go through trauma. But I want to emphasize that trauma is a physiological process, okay? So one of the things I'm fond of pointing out that I got from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is that our bodies always function the way they're supposed to. And even when outside things cause us to react in a certain way, our bodies react in predictable ways. I don't know how to pause this. Stuff is gonna appear. Don't be distracted. But we can learn to understand those predictable patterns, and from those figure out what's going on and how we're reacting and manage those a little better, and we could teach others. Trauma is not a disorder, it's an injury. Trauma originates in our nervous system, again, as our nervous system helps us to understand that there's a problem. In trauma, kids are in this loop where they're constantly trying to reorganize and seek a resolution. And then trauma typically results from thwarted natural processes where we always have this override ability. We step in and we try to make ourselves feel better, or we try to make the trauma stop, the stress stop. And when we do that, we actually create more of a problem than we solve, because the process of healing trauma is working through things even when they're painful. And you guys know that a kid that's in pain wants to figure out a way to make it stop. And sometimes that involves just cutting off the process of handling it. And we can give people a safe place to do that, okay? Trauma, when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about the experience of trauma, which is being overwhelmed by something that comes from the outside. Our reactions from the inside can lead to that trauma. Things come too fast and are too complicated for us to handle, and we end up feeling helpless or hopeless. The work of trauma has really, one thing about trauma research is that we'll hit it really hard and then it'll disappear for 20 or 30 years. We are in a period of time where we're looking at trauma. We're in one of those cycles, and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, my hero, started really looking at trauma in the treatment of PTSD. And PTSD is really the mile marker when you look at that what you experience in PTSD is what you are addressing when you're talking about all kinds of trauma. And it's a difficulty relaxing, feeling safe. It's a constant state of hyperarousal and hypervigilance. And it's a loop where, because your sense of time, which is one of your executive functions, is compromised, you can't tell that a trauma is over. Okay, you can't tell that that's in the past. It all kind of runs together. So there are two types of trauma. There's the specific time-limited trauma, like a disaster or like a quarantine, that are a little bit easier to gauge because you can tell when they begin, you can tell when they end. They are among the most easily treated forms of trauma. The one that is more difficult is complex trauma. And we're talking about neglect that happens up until a kid is 5 or so. That's the more common, I should say. Older kids experience complex trauma in the form of abuse, physical, sexual, or verbal, and in living situations where there's violence or abuse or extreme forms of neglect. I'm going to skip over this one as well. 4 components of trauma: hyperarousal, constriction, dissociation, and helplessness. I'm going to breeze through this next part just a little bit because I want to get to my interventions. So I apologize for this. I told Sandy ahead of time I'm a little long-winded, but my marker here is I need to get to what you guys probably want to know about a little bit. Okay, yes, I overstocked my presentation here. The bottom line on trauma is that the root of trauma is expectation. What are kids expecting? How do traumatized kids expect to be treated? If they learn that they can expect to be treated with unconditional positive regard, that they can be heard, then that's a game changer for them. And that requires time, that requires investment. If, because of their survival instincts or because of the negative or positive cognitions that they've developed over time, in trauma we see these negative beliefs about themselves, or they've developed these guiding ideas of life that may not be correct. They may be very stress-inducing, beliefs about the way they think things should operate. Those are the things that we need to address. One of the key, another arrow in our quiver is teaching kids about compassion. It's not your fault. Kids will blame and they'll shame themselves. I hope I have time to get to those slides, but reinforcing upon a kid that the things they've been through and the decisions they've made in the wake of that, that's not their fault. Teaching kids boundaries, particularly young ladies, but young men to not much lesser of an extent. If they've been abused or neglected, particularly sexually abused, their boundaries are not there. They don't know what appropriate relationships are. So teaching them that is important. And then more important than anything is normalizing. Letting them know that you will listen. You know, I put Andy Griffith there because, man, just something about looking at him and the expressions on his face is just very comforting. And I want to be the person that just breathes, hey, I'm here to listen and take care of you and help you in any way I can. And I'm going to listen to you no matter what nonsense comes out of someone's mouth sometimes. I'm gonna let them know that they're okay. And if you do nothing else, let the people you're talking to know they're okay. All right, so here is the nuts and bolts of what I wanted to get to today. The dealing with trauma, and I hope that doesn't sound insensitive when I say dealing with. Sometimes that language is a little hard for people to hear. It's not a chore so much as it is a passion and a calling, helping kids with trauma. But I've outlined here a multi-pronged approach. I would love to tell you that I have worked from beginning to end, but this is in development because there's some of these things that schools are just now embracing. But I've put it here, I've listed it here in order of things that we absolutely have to have in place for every child, all the way on the continuum to things that if and when we get to work through them, they will be very focused on the most, kids that are severely traumatized. But you can see here the things that are, all of the weapons at our disposal in helping a kid through trauma. And guys, as counselors, we are on the front lines. As a therapist, I like to think of myself as kind of, I'm able to do some of the things that I can't do in a school, but you guys do the core work. We do the core work. I'm taking one hat off, putting another hat on. We do the core work. The most important parts of this are not the things at the bottom. They're the things at the beginning. So let me get into some of these things, as many as I can in the time that we have together. So asset building, if you're not familiar with the work of the Search Institute, this was in the educational conscience way before the ACEs was. The ACEs study was. My grammar sounds weird when I say it like that. But the 40 assets are the things that, as you get closer to 40 assets in a kid's life, they are closer and closer to self-actualization and mental and emotional well-being. And so with this in mind, when we look at a kid and when we bring in their parents and say, hey, here are the 40 assets, how many of these do your kids have? And we work with parents. I've worked with parents that are not able to put a lot of these in. And so where can we find the resources and the assets in the community? And how can I help you in a very non-judgmental way? Because we can only begin where we are and proceed from there. But if we can establish these in the lives of all of our kids, then we make a huge difference. And percentage wise, if you were able to look at a kid and see the level of emotional competence and ability to deal with trauma, their resilience, we know, if we establish this, that thing's going to level up most of the way. It may be blocked by a little bit of trauma that we have to deal with in other ways, but this is where most of the work is done. And this is something that any of us can do, any of the stakeholders involved can do. I put a slide here about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change. we joke about how the brain is not fully formed until a kid is 25 or so. But the truth is, there's always some change that can take place. And I'm very optimistic about that. The things that can change a brain, you'll see that there are some negative things on here: traumatic stress, or traumatic events, stress, but also through social interaction, meditation, better diet, exercise. A lot of these are on that assets list, but some of these are things that we can incorporate. I love new experiences, because in this time of isolation, that's one of the things that we're adding to a lot of our own children's lives. Okay, I'm going to skip just a little bit. So brief interventions. So when I point out brief interventions, I'm talking about really simple things that we can do for kids when they're in crisis. And it doesn't have to be an explosive or really severe incident. These are things we can do day to day with kids. The VAL check-in I love from Brene Brown, where you ask a kid, what are the things that you are starting to eliminate from your life in order to be in a better situation? What are the emotions that you're experiencing right now? What are some things you're doing? The I, what are things you're doing for yourself? O, what are things that you're doing for others? The U, is there anything that's unexpressed in your life? And then the Y is, what are you celebrating? So that's a very quick thing. If you look up the Brene Brown VAL check-in, I think the first thing that would come up would, because I've tried to find a good screen capture, there's a Pinterest article on it. You can see how often I use Pinterest, because I don't think there are articles on Pinterest. They're just things that are pinned up there. Breathing, teaching kids breathing and heart rate variability. The proper balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. They've shown that if the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are out of whack, that can lead to anything from stress all the way to cancer. And I know there's research there, and I want to be responsible and not saying too much about what that can be. Suffice it to say, it's severe, but we can teach kids to tap their brake and control their brake and their accelerator, so their parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, just through their breathing. Tapping, if you look up the therapeutic tapping, just some very simple exercises that we could teach kids in a classroom. 5-point check-in, so their senses. A very simple grounding technique that I teach my kids in my office, whether I'm at school or outside, is what are 5 things you can touch, taste, see, hear, and whatever the 5th sense that I left out is. Okay, so just 5 things. So getting them to slow down and recognize where they are and to be present. Because again, when that sense of time that trauma compromises is out of whack, they're all over. They're imagining things that happen in the future, that might happen in the future. They are experiencing things in the past, and they can't tell that there is a present that they are solely responsible for, that's manageable. And so getting them to return into that. Free writing is something that I prescribe a lot for homework. I'll give somebody a topic having to do with what we've been talking about, having to do with how they're managing their own stress, and just getting them to write freely. And whether I read it or not, a guy at UT, that's University of Texas. I'm an Aggie, so I hate to mention them, but I've got to give them the props when it's due. But free writing, just learning to process that experience, and it's not graded, it's not checked for spelling, there's no punctuation. So I encourage you to think of other things you use. This emotional freedom technique manual that I put out here is available on the web, and that goes into a little bit more detail on the tapping. Okay, mindfulness, I'm gonna skip over just a little bit because we talk about mindfulness a lot. I think I see some heads nodding. I think we can agree on that. So motivational interviewing. This is that green section on that chart that I showed at the front. Motivational interviewing is based on the core tenets of counseling. It's non-judgmental, it's non-confrontational, it's non-adversarial. But when you look into it, motivational interviewing is asking the right questions in the right proportions, getting kids to think about their own motivation for change. And one of the key things in motivational interviewing is getting kids to verbalize why they want to change, are they ready to change, and are they able to change? And exploring those three aspects, the readiness, willingness, and ability to change. And when they verbalize that, and you get them to verbalize that frequently, that has a powerful effect. Just speaking that out loud, that's positive recognition of the need and the ability to change, allows them to articulate whether they are truly willing or not. And then, okay, let's resolve that. So that articulation and that resolution of ambivalence. Readiness to change is not a static trait, okay? And the spirit of motivational interviewing is getting them to realize that they are ready to change, that they can be ready to change, or at least getting them to that point. And motivational interviewing is a dyad. It's a relationship. It's not a Jedi and Padawan. I just watched a Star Wars movie, or a teacher-student relationship. It's, hey, I am your companion in this journey. 4 principles in motivational interviewing: expressing empathy, developing discrepancy. So really pointing out in a non-confrontational way, is your thinking faulty? And then rolling with resistance. I give this to parents a lot. I use this when I'm coaching parents a lot for the kids that I counsel. Really knowing your own touch points, your own triggers, because in a dyad, oftentimes you might get triggered, right? And so a kid is going to resist you, and so you're going to want to resist back. But really being able to step back and say, hey, I am in the process of helping this kid, really knowing where you want to get, so you're not pulled into the moment where that resistance occurs. But motivational interviewing at its core is really asking the questions and asking them in a systematic way. And Miller and Rolnick have written a wonderful book on motivational interviewing, very technical, but at the same time, very easy. And I say technical in this case because it's very straightforward. But asking questions that help kids realize where they're at. And it's a very simple technique. It's beautiful in its simplicity, but once you learn this technique, motivational interviewing, it really is a game changer. And this is one that we can practice without having any special licensure or anything else. It's a technique that really just brings in a lot of things that we probably already do. Open-ended questioning and affirmation. Those are beautiful things. And then reflections and summaries. Okay. So again, get this PowerPoint from me. There's a lot of words I've put in, a lot of explanation that will help you later, that I'd like you to go back and look at. getting kids to realize, getting people to realize what are the things that keep them from changing. And we'll get into ACT a little bit here, ACT, I should say. I'm a practitioner of it, and I can't break myself of using the acronym. I think being from a military family, I want to go with the acronym, but actually ACT is pronounced ACT in every case. It's based on relational frame theory. It's not based on getting rid of symptoms. A lot of times in counseling, we want to address symptoms, but ACT is based on meeting people exactly where they are, and instead of sorry, my animations, getting rid of symptoms, it's based on moving through things and getting them to where they want to be. ACT is based on a construct called psychological flexibility. It's not about controlling emotions or regulating emotions, which dialectical behavioral therapy touches more on. It's about being able to live in the moment mindfully and coexist with really troubling and negative emotions. There's a lot of metaphors in ACT, which I think makes it really relatable to kids. You use paradox a lot. Again, that stepping into and resolving discrepancy. ACT can be used, even though it's very, very basic and simple, it can be used on populations as strongly pathological as schizophrenia. The goal of ACT is creating a rich and meaningful life. So I think it really speaks to where we are in society right now with mindfulness and grasping our virtues and things like that. The techniques are acceptance of who you are and where you're at, diffusion. So taking, diffusion isn't what it sounds like if you're not familiar with the term. Diffusion is actually being able to separate yourself from your emotions. Students in trauma are enmeshed with their emotions. And so being able to pull away with your thinking brain and acknowledging those emotions, using what's called the observing self. So seeing that you're going through an emotion, being okay with the chemical response that's going on, but being able to rationally look at that and deal with that. And so I'll move from there. So the emotional control strategies that ACT really gets into are more about being able to manage, making room for unpleasant thoughts without struggling. One of the key things in there that you can talk to your kids about is what's called the struggle switch. But confronting their agenda, you know, and then introducing the 6 core principles, again, diffusion, acceptance, which is making room and just expanding and allowing things to happen without challenging what the body, which again is doing exactly what it's supposed to without challenging that, letting the body do what it does. Contacting with the present moment, again, the 5 senses, allowing negative thoughts to come and go, just being able to be still and to be mindful. Observing, the observing self is observing your emotions, but also noticing that you're transcendent. The emotions are part of the body, and without getting too philosophical again, we are transcendent from what's going on in the body. We have the ability, the autonomy to regulate what's going on in every aspect of that. And then the main thing that we want to work to and ACT is getting kids to grasp their values. Again, I am a person who, what? And then taking committed action, realizing that they can set goals and they can move through them. I'm not gonna get to somatic experiencing, but really what we see in trauma, if you learn nothing else from me about trauma, kids get stuck in trauma because there is this situation that they don't think they know how to resolve. And because they can't resolve it, they are stuck there and they're stuck reliving it. But if we can get them to the point, and we can do so through things like EMDR or somatic experiencing, and again, those require special training. But if we can get them to the point where they feel like those things are under control, or that they can handle those things if they come up again, then that's huge. Okay, so DBT, again, I'll put this book here. This is a fantastic book of skills that we can use. Dialectical behavioral therapy itself was developed by Francine Shapiro, who herself suffers with borderline personality disorder. She's a therapist, but it's based, and what I did here, I wanted to point out how well DBT lines up with SEL, how well dialectical behavioral therapy lines up with SEL. There are 4 components of DBT that go along with the 6 basic components of our SEL model. There's mindfulness, which goes along with our personal well-being. There's distress tolerance, which talks about self-awareness and getting us to a point of resilience. Interpersonal effectiveness, which deals with our social awareness, our responsible decision-making and relationship skills. This is something that we should really hit hard with our kids as we start getting into more and more classrooms and running more and more groups. And there's emotional regulation, which is a skill. I work in a middle school, so I don't see a whole lot of emotional regulation. Kids are still learning that. But I know from 15 years in the high school that high schoolers are no more equipped in that area. So if we can really, whether we become practitioners of DBT or not, and I love this so much, I have sought the proper training in DBT, but you can really get into DBT and borrow a lot of the skills here without having to call yourself a practitioner, without having to violate any ethics that we have in place. But there are, this is an extremely valuable therapy, and I'm looking at my watch and knowing there's no way that I'm going to get where I need to be. But it's extremely valuable with the most challenging. I don't know if you recognize borderline personality disorder sufferers when you see them, but a lot of our kids, without painting too broad of a brush, a lot of our cutters and some of our kids that are extremely emotionally dysregulated, this is really a bell cow therapy for that. Okay, so I'm going to skip over CFT. This is one I was hoping to get into, but I knew I might not get to. So here's EMDR. And I know a lot of you want to know more about EMDR, and I really encourage you, because EMDR, I think most people will agree, especially practitioners of it. I have been trained in a 60-hour EMDR. That's the introduction to EMDR, just so you can begin practicing it. EMDR, in very short order, takes kids and adults, but I mainly work with kids. You really almost within the first session or 2 of EMDR start seeing real growth. And so EMDR is the closest example in real life to magic I can imagine, because when kids are brought to the point where they are working through their memories, and let me explain a little bit about what EMDR is. EMDR is based on eye movement, where you're getting kids to use what is called bilateral stimulation. And it looks weird, it looks like hypnosis, but all it really is getting kids to access both sides of their brain simultaneously in the process of a memory, of working through a traumatic memory. And that's why I put that down there in the red, because one of the ethics specifically states brief interventions, and EMDR is not really a brief intervention. There is a form of EMDR that we've talked about this week, Dr. Benavides and others that I've been with, called Flash or Flash EMDR. Still not something you can utilize without the proper training, but EMDR is we're working towards the point of understanding, and I say we as part of a larger community. The EMDR community itself is called EMDRIA, EMDRIA. You can become a member. But going back to EMDR, working through a memory so that you can get a person to the point where they are desensitized, where they can, and that sounds like a strong term. It actually sounds pretty archaic. And I know we are out of time. I am sorry for that. I will actually redo this and put it on Zoom. So if you're brave and you want to go through the whole thing, I will do that in a way where I'm not regulated by time.
Hey, Mike, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to say, people are really intrigued by a lot of the strategies, and maybe as something we can work out on the back end, maybe we do a kind of second step or second series in this.
Okay. Yeah.
A few of these. Because I think the dialogue is great, and that's what people want. And they're looking at these little breakout sessions and strategies. I'm hearing, people are like, I would be kind of unsure about doing that, and that's okay. That is what we would discuss deeper, because there are things you can do without being therapy-like or without doing anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. So I think that the best solution is going to be, we've got to dig deeper. This is kind of like the overarching view.
Yes.
But, as we've been working in collaboration together, we've talked about, modifying these strategies and making them counselor appropriate, school counselor in particular appropriate. And so I think that's where the work's going to take us next. And I'd love to work with you and make this part of another, it may need to be a series, actually. The more I think about it, there's just so many, and it goes in line with what we're planning to do for transition anyways. So y'all, to be continued for sure. I just don't want you to spend all your time re-recording, because I think we can capture this in a more effective way. And my brain's just like all illuminated reading the comments, listening to you. Mike, this was incredible. Thank you so much. So much information, y'all. I know you might be a little bit on overload, but trust me, we're going to capture this and we're going to dig deeper. And we're going to focus on the techniques and strategies. So this is kind of like the intro. And what I like to do, I think the modeling piece is so important. And that's what we miss a lot of the time with PD. And so my hope is that we will talk about a strategy and model the strategy so that we can see that this is the way it's supposed to look, or this is what is supposed to happen. So again, I'm taking your feedback, working with my resources. We've already had some of these conversations happening in the background, but I know Mike has to go. He's got another meeting he's leading. Hey, Mike, if you'll just send me your presentation, it'll be easier for me to send one.
Yeah, that's it.
Instead of them emailing you and building up your email. But I'll capture any last minute questions and send them to you so we make sure we get them answered. But I want to make sure that I honor your time and get you off to your next session that has already started. But thank you, thank you, thank you. We are so appreciative of the information.
Well, thanks to everyone for being a part of this. And I hope I get to answer a lot of questions and have a lot of good dialogue about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, Mike, you take care. And everyone else, I promise you, we are making a series and we are going to dig deeper into these ideas and strategies. You will have the presentation. So if you are a clinician or you feel like, oh, I'm ready to up and go, I just want to read some things, please, take that information and go. I will send it to you as soon as Mike gets it to me. I know he's Zoom hopping the rest of the day, so it may be a little bit before he gets it to me. I'll get a recording of the video as well. And just know that we're working behind the scenes fast and furiously to provide you everything you need to comprehensively attack the emotional issues and trauma that we're going to deal with. Whether we transition back or not, whatever hits us in the next few months, I know that the counselors that are attending these sessions will be ready. And that was my hope for you, is to really strengthen your pedagogy to be the best counselor you can be. So thank you everyone for being on this journey. This is a journey, and we are walking alongside each other. And so it's really been an honor to work through this with you. I have to say that I've changed my whole philosophy, you know, in PD in general. These are things I've always wanted to do, but I felt there was never enough time. You know, time's a factor, but now we almost have nothing but time. And so I want to maximize your time as you work through everything that's going on. So thank you. Thank you. I know we're 3 minutes after. We will be checking attendance. We will get you your credit. Please give us 24 to 48 hours to do that. My poor Presley, she is slammed. We are all slammed. And so she's just moving as fast as she can. So I want you all to have a wonderful rest of your week. We're almost to Friday, we're pre-Friday. And so please enjoy yourselves, get a little bit of sun, and I'll see you next week. Next week we have a lot of sessions going on. So if you haven't signed up, go ahead and get signed up, and I'll see you next week. Y'all take care.